Hello, I'm Chris Copp. I'm Senior Museums Officer with Staffordshire Archives and Heritage, and I'm going to talk to you today about the fascinating story of Stafford and Stone shoe industry, the defining industry for both these towns. And it's now over 20 years since that industry finished in Stafford, so it's quite a time ago now. So it's quite salutary, I think, just to have a look at our town's history and how it shaped the way they are today. And Stafford's industry goes back to the 12th century. That's when the first records appear of shoemaking going on in the town. And by 1476, the industry was strong enough, or at least there were enough people involved in shoemaking, that they formed their own guild to protect their trade and the people who were working in it. So why are shoes so important? I mean, we mostly all wear them. They're really crucial. They protect our feet, they keep them dry, they let us walk around, play sport and so on and so forth. They're made from a variety of materials. They haven't always been just made out of leather, although that was the case till quite recently, but fabric, wood, textiles, plastics, all kinds of materials today in modern shoes. And there are really sort of 5 main processes in shoemaking. The first is clicking, and that's the cutting out of the leather pieces which make up the top of the shoe. Then there is closing, which is sewing together those pieces, originally by hand, but nowadays, along with everything else, by machine. Then lasting, which is forming the finished upper, the closed upper, around the last, and then attaching all the other parts to it. Including the soles, and attaching the soles to the rest of the shoe is generally called making. And then last of all, once you've made the shoe, once the shoemakers have made the shoe, it usually looks quite rough. So you have a series of processes called finishing, which involve treating the leather with waxes, with polishes and colour, trimming off any rough edges and so on. So that's what gives you the final finished shoe, which looks very smart indeed. And really up until, well, mid-19th century, as we'll talk about in a bit, and definitely by 1900, all those jobs were really done by hand. Different people had different skills. A master shoemaker might have all those skills. Originally, a lot of shoemaking would have been done in a workshop in people's homes, and the master shoemaker might have a journeyman working with him, an apprentice as well. And the shoemaker would always do the clicking. Leather is the most valuable commodity. It's an expensive material, and the clicker really makes sure that he makes best use of that material. The journeyman might do some of the jobs like cutting out the bottom stuff, the heels and the soles and so on. And then the apprentice, he'd probably do, apart from sort of running around doing chores and those sort of day-to-day jobs, he would do a lot of the finishing jobs as well. So he'd finish off the shoes by applying the polishes and so on. We often get asked why Stafford? Why was Stafford a shoemaking centre? You've got to remember there's one of a number of shoemaking centres: Northampton, Oxford, York, Norwich, London, Bristol. Quite a few places were making shoes in the 18th and 19th centuries. And it's a difficult question to answer. One is that there was a ready source of raw materials. Stafford is a pastoral county. Lots of cattle farming, and leather is a byproduct of cattle farming, and the town had good transport links as well. But I suppose a simple answer is, and a vague answer really, is that like a lot of towns which basically base their economy on markets and agriculture, as we moved into the industrial age, a lot of these towns developed a specialism. Might be brewing in Burton, the silk industry in Leek, pottery and coal mining in Stoke-on-Trent and so on. And I think it just so happened that Stafford got in quite early on the shoemaking business, and it became by 1800 really it became the defining industry for the town.
Okay.
By the late 19th century there were quite a lot of shoemaking companies in Stafford. Hollins, Ellie, Podmore, Lloyd's, to name but a few, all doing very well. Their owners becoming very wealthy and important men in town business. And similarly in Stone, Richard Vernon became a very successful man exporting shoes to Australia in particular. But by 1900, Lotus, or Bostocks I should say as they were called at the time, they were the most important company. And in 1919, the 3 Bostock factories in Northampton, Stone and Stafford amalgamated to become Lotus Limited. Lotus was already a brand that they were already using, and it was a symbol of perfection. A lotus flower is a beautiful thing, and they saw their shoes, and as we've mentioned, they made high quality women's shoes. That was Stafford and Stone's defining product, was that high quality of shoe, and they felt that the lotus flower was the best symbol of that. Still employing thousands of people, about 3,000 people in Stafford, about 1,000 in Stone, the majority working for Lotus. And Lotus were really a very self-contained company. They made their own heels, they made their own packing cases, serviced their own machinery. They had subsidiaries which fitted their shops. They had Lotus and Delta chain of shops which sold their product. And they had all sorts of social functions and welfare functions associated with the factories as well. A stage for their amateur dramatic societies, their own Girl Guides group, and so on and so on. So you really get a picture that they really did everything for their employees, and it was a real community in itself throughout the 20th century. And the north end of Stafford, if ever you've been around Marston Road, Sandon Road, it's got a very distinctive feel, and that's really down to it being based around shoemaking industries. You see the big large box factories which are typical of shoemaking, lots of housing, shops associated, the Sandonia Theatre which was really built to service that community. It's a very distinctive part of Stafford, and it's really down to shoemaking. So during the 18th century, most shoemaking was still bespoke. It was made for individual people. You'd have a pattern made from your foot to form the last, and then the pair of shoes we'd made specifically for you. But then certain things started to happen in the 18th century, which meant that with a demand for wholesale shoes, for shoes off the shelf. So people began to mass produce them to be exported or transported to other parts of the country or abroad to be sold for purchase elsewhere. And the drivers for this were really the Napoleonic Wars in the later 18th century, and also the new export markets, places like Australia and Canada, who had yet to industrialise, who had a new demand for shoemaking. And one of the first person to really make a success of this in Stafford was William Horton. He started business in 1767, and what he started doing was sending out pieces of leather from a warehouse he had behind Chetwynd House in Stafford on Bridge Street, and he'd have clickers employed there who would cut out the leather, and then that will be passed out to outworkers in Stafford, places like Eccleshall, Stone, other villages, who would then put together the shoes and then return them for payment and for the next batch of leather. And he was very successful at this. It's estimated by 1800 he was employing over 1,000 people in Stafford. And a chap called William Dixon in Stone played a similar role. He was a successful businessman, had a manufactory on High Street, and started to develop a business. But a lot of the shoemaking was still made in very small businesses, people employing 10, 20 people, such as this building behind me here, an early mid-19th century little shoe workshop really at the back of Granville Terrace, which we think was part of a business operated by a man called Job Johnson in the middle and later 19th century. Yes, Horton was quite clearly a wealthy man, as you can see from his home at Chetwynd House in Stafford. Most of you would be more familiar with that as the old post office in the town. He was really successful, and he had some important friends as well. The playwright R.B. Sheridan, who was MP for Stafford at the end of the 18th and start of the 19th century, he used to stay with Horton at Chetwynd House. And it's Sheridan who famously said that may the manufactures of Stafford be trodden underfoot by all the world. A sort of a witty point that Stafford's wealth and success was built on the shoe industry. In 1814, Thomas Bostock moved from Derbyshire into Stafford and set up bespoke shoe business on Foregate in Stafford. He was joined in 1833 by his son Edwin, and then a few years later, 1842, Edwin's brother Thomas set up a factory in the High Street in Stone, and around the same time his brother, their brother Frederick, also set up a business in Northampton. Now Edwin was crucial in setting up the factory system. Edwin Bostock introduced the sewing machine into the shoe industry in Britain. The first to introduce it, he imported 3 Elias Howe sewing machines in October 1855, and we'll just let this car go by while I carry on. And this was really the start of bringing in outworkers into the factory system. So you start having factories not long after this time. Now the workers weren't very happy about this at the time. It meant that their working practices were restricted. They might have other businesses like a shop or a small holding, and having to go to a factory for fixed hours, they felt that was restrictive. So there were a series of strikes, but by July 1859 the sewing machine was here to stay, and Edwin Bostock and the other Bostock factories rapidly introduced them into their businesses. And this is really the start of the factory setup in the shoemaking industry. So you start getting them built in places like the north part of Stafford, and then places like here in Stone. This is Cross Street, and behind me to the right was where Thomas Bostock built his first stone factory here on Cross Street in about 1861. So the introduction of sewing machines to do the closing part of shoemaking, which was a job usually done by women, almost entirely done by women. This was the first process to be brought into a factory setting. It enabled factory owners to control hours, wages, production, all those kinds of aspects. But lots of the other parts of the shoemaking process were still in people's homes, and this really continued to some extent until about 1900, by which point new machines had been invented. And in the later 19th century there were lots and lots of different manufacturers working in the shoe industry. In 1880 there were about 39 shoemakers in Stafford, employing over 3,000 people. And in Stone are about a dozen manufacturers employing over 1,000 people. So after the Second World War, this industry really started to decline. In the 1950s there were only 3 or 4 manufacturers around in Stafford and a couple in Stone, and by 1957 Lotus was the only manufacturer in both towns. One C.H. Riley and Sons closed in 1957, and In Vogue Shoes in Stone not around about the same time. But in 1950 Stone Lotus built this brand new factory which you can see behind me. State of the art, very modern, very stylish, and the company was still doing well on the back of its reputation for producing high quality women's shoes. The Bostock family involvement in Lotus finished in 1970 when James Bostock left the board of directors. And the factory behind me closed in 1975 when Lotus left and it was bought by GEC and then later ABB. But Lotus continued to do quite well in the 1970s. They had contracts, lucrative contracts with Debenhams and Marks and Spencers, trading on their reputation for producing high quality women's shoes. And they also had markets beyond the Iron Curtain in Russia and the Eastern Bloc. However, business continued to decline against competitive markets first in Italy and then the Far East. And by the 1990s, really the writing was on the wall. FII Group sold the Stafford factory in 1997 and demolished it to make way for housing. And in 1998, the final 140 workers on the Lotus site in Stafford were made redundant. And that really ended Stafford's story as a shoemaking town. There's a lot of other interesting aspects to Stafford's industry we can't really talk to you about a great deal at the moment. I'm running out of time really. But a lot of the industries in Stafford were based around the shoe industry. Venables started making packing cases. Dorman started life making cutting knives. Universal Grinding Wheel making grindstones to help in the finishing of shoes, and so on and so on. The main survivor really is Bostock, who as Evo and before that Spick and Span polishers, made shoe polishes and adhesives for Lotus in particular. Now, if you want to find out more about Staffordshire's fantastically interesting and productive shoe industry, you can look at our Staffordshire Past Track website. Lots and lots of photographs of shoes and objects and so on at www.staffspasttrack.org.uk. And if you look on the front page, you can find links to sub-sites, and one of those is called Heart and Soul, and it's lots and lots of information on Stafford's shoe industry. Hope you've enjoyed this talk. And I hope you all stay safe in these difficult times. Thank you.